A warrior without destiny arrives in a galaxy consumed by prophecy. His sword drinks the oil of machines that were never meant to bleed. The Jedi seek to understand him, but the Force itself recoils from what he has become. He carries no allegiance to Republic or Separatist, only a hatred forged in a darkness this universe has never known. The Sith believe they can claim him as a weapon, but weapons do not choose their masters. And when Asajj Ventress ignites her lightsabers before a man who has already killed gods, she will learn that some survivors cannot be broken, cannot be turned, and cannot be stopped. In a war built on the balance between light and dark, what happens when something enters that refuses both? The first battle droids fell before dawn on Christophsis, their photoreceptors still calibrated for darkness when the Republic gunships descended through ash-thick clouds. The city had been a jewel once, its crystal spires refracting twin sunlight into prismatic beauty that merchants called the crown of the outer rim. Now those towers lay shattered, their facets dulled by carbon scoring and the greasy residue of Tibanna gas explosions. The Separatist occupation had transformed elegance into ruin, and the clone army of the Republic had arrived to reclaim what remained through fire and precision and the unrelenting mathematics of war. Commander Cody stood in the open bay of a low-altitude assault transport as it banked hard over what the tactical display designated Zone 7 Auric, his yellow-marked armor catching the first pale fingers of sunrise. Below, the 212th Attack Battalion moved in textbook formation through rubble-choked streets, their white plastoid forms weaving between the skeletal remains of buildings while suppressing fire stitched orange lines across his vision. The battle was proceeding according to projection. Casualties remained within acceptable parameters. General Kenobi had drawn the main droid force toward the northern manufacturing district, creating the opening Cody now exploited with characteristic efficiency. Everything was unfolding as planned until the gunship pilot's voice crackled through his helmet, stripped of its usual steady calm. "Commander, I'm seeing movement in Grid Square 87. Single organic signature. No IFF transponder." Cody magnified the sector through his HUD, watching thermal imaging paint a lone figure moving through what should have been a Separatist-controlled kill zone. The signature burned hot, living, unmistakable in its solitude. Around it, battle droid signatures winked out with mechanical regularity, disappearing from sensors as if swallowed by shadow. "Confirmed visual?" Cody asked. "Negative, sir. Too much debris. But the signature is eliminating hostiles at a rate inconsistent with conventional armament." The Force shuddered. Not that Cody could feel such things, not like the General could, but he had learned to recognize the signs. The way Kenobi's posture would shift almost imperceptibly. The brief pause before issuing orders, as if listening to counsel no clone could hear. The Jedi spoke of the Force as an energy field that connected all living things, binding the galaxy together in currents of light and shadow. To Cody, it was simply another tactical variable, one he could observe but never truly comprehend. "Reroute to Grid 87, he ordered. "Combat approach. The LAAT." I banked sharply, its twin mass driver cannons swiveling to track potential threats as Christophsis's broken cityscape blurred past. Through the viewport, Cody watched smoke rising in black columns, backlit by explosions that bloomed like deadly flowers across the horizon. The Clone Wars had been raging for 6 standard months now, and already entire worlds bore scars that would outlast generations. The Separatist alliance under Count Dooku had fractured the Republic, turning political grievance into armed insurrection, and the Jedi Order had been forced to become generals in a conflict that violated every principle of their peacekeeping tradition. The gunship descended into the canyon formed by 2 collapsed crystalline towers, their jagged edges reaching toward each other like broken fingers that would never again touch. The pilot killed forward momentum, hovering 20 meters above a plaza that had once hosted merchants from across the galaxy. Now it was a killing ground. Bodies littered the permacrete, But they were not the white armored forms Cody had learned to grieve in the efficient, compartmentalized way that allowed him to continue functioning. These were battle droids, dozens of them, their tangent-colored chassis twisted into configurations that spoke of tremendous kinetic force applied with brutal efficiency. Some had been cleaved in half. The molecular bonds of duranium alloy parted as cleanly as fabric. Others bore massive crushing damage, as if struck by artillery shells rather than conventional weapons. At the center of the carnage stood a figure that Cody's training initially categorized as human male, though something in the man's bearing suggested a classification that simple failed to capture essential truth. He was massive, standing well over 2 meters tall, his body encased in what appeared to be archaic plate armor that predated anything in the Republic's historical database. The armor was black, scarred by countless impacts, and it absorbed the pale morning light rather than reflecting it. One pauldron bore damage that looked like claw marks, as if some beast had attempted to tear through the metal and failed. But it was the weapon that held Cody's attention with the same magnetic inevitability as a singularity. The man carried a sword, if such a word could adequately describe the object gripped in his gauntleted hands. It was longer than a human was tall, a slab of dark metal that seemed less forged than torn from some fundamental substrate of violence itself. The blade was as wide as a man's torso at its base, tapering to a brutal point, its edge notched and scarred but unmistakably sharp. No power cell hummed within its construction. No plasma field shimmered along its length. It was simply iron and mass, and the terrible leverage of a body conditioned to wield it. The man turned as the gunship's shadow fell across him, and Cody saw his face. One eye glared up at the hovering transport, the other hidden behind a band of dark metal that bisected his scarred features. That single eye held something that Cody's accelerated combat conditioning recognized immediately, not the heat of battle rage, which burned bright and exhausted itself quickly, but the cold ember of hatred that could smolder for years without consuming itself. It was the look of someone who had fought so long that combat had become not a skill but a state of being, as natural and necessary as breathing. The man raised his massive sword and held it across his body in a guard position that was simultaneously archaic and perfectly efficient. Behind him, more battle droids emerged from the rubble, their vocabulators chattering target acquisition protocols. Organic designation: unknown. Threat assessment: extreme. Directive: terminate with prejudice. The droids opened fire, blue stun bolts lancing toward the armored figure in precise, overlapping patterns designed to overwhelm any individual combatant. The clone army had studied separatist tactics extensively. The droids were not intelligent, but they were efficient, their programming optimized for exactly this scenario. The man moved. Cody's enhanced reflexes, conditioned through Kamino's brutal training regimens and refined across 100 battlefields, barely tracked the motion. The massive sword blurred through space, its impossible mass somehow achieving velocity that violated basic assumptions about leverage and human strength. The blade caught the first volley of blaster bolts and deflected them, not with the elegant precision of a lightsaber's plasma blade, but through the simple expedient of presenting an angled surface that sent coherent light scattering in harmless directions. The sword completed its arc and removed 3 battle droids from existence, cleaving through them with such force that their severed chassis sailed through the air in spinning fragments. The man followed his blade's momentum, his armored body moving with terrible efficiency as he closed the distance to the remaining droids. Each step covered more ground than anatomy should permit, as if momentum itself bent to accommodate his will. A super battle droid, its heavy chassis mounting dual blaster cannons, locked onto the approaching target and unleashed a sustained burst. The armored man took the hits on his pauldron and continued forward without breaking stride. Metal scorched, atmosphere ionized. The distance collapsed to zero. The massive sword rose and fell like an executioner's blade, and the super battle droid's reinforced chassis proved exactly as durable as the cheaper models, which was to say, insufficient. "Get me on the ground," Cody ordered. "Spread out, establish a perimeter. Stun setting only until we determine if this is a local insurgent or something else." The LAAT. I descended on repulsor lifts, its side doors sliding open to disgorge 8 clone troopers who moved with the synchronized precision that was their birthright. They spread into a textbook defensive formation, their DC-15 carbines tracking the armored figure who now stood amid the wreckage of 16 battle droids, his chest heaving, his massive sword planted point first in the permacrete, like a crude standard. Cody descended the ramp with his own weapon lowered but ready, his HUD painting trajectory solutions across his vision in case this situation deteriorated into necessary violence. At this range, he could see details that sensors had missed. The man's armor was not duranium or Beskar or any alloy Cody recognized. It looked almost like simple iron, impossibly primitive, yet it had turned aside blaster fire that should have punched through plate steel like tissue. The man's single eye tracked Cody's approach with the dead, evaluating gaze of someone who had killed too often to maintain illusions about combat's nobility. "Lower your weapon," Cody said, his voice amplified through his helmet's external speakers. "You are in a Republic-secured zone. Identify yourself and state your allegiance." The man's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile if smiles could contain only bitter recognition of the galaxy's essential cruelty. "I have no allegiance," he said, his voice rough as stone grinding against stone, "and I lower my weapon for no one." The accent was wrong. The basic was grammatically correct but delivered with phonetic patterns that did not match any world in the Republic database. Cody's tactical computer cross-referenced against every known human colony, every isolationist enclave, every hidden population that had emerged during the Clone Wars. Nothing matched. "Then you'll die here," Cody said, without heat or particular emphasis. It was simply tactical assessment delivered as fact. The man's grip on his sword shifted almost imperceptibly. Cody's finger moved to his trigger, muscles tensing for combat that would begin and end in the space between heartbeats. "Commander," one of his troopers said, his voice tight with the kind of controlled tension that preceded explosive action. "I'm reading another organic signature, incoming fast, airborne." Cody's HUD snapped to the new threat vector, tracking something descending from the ruined towers above with unnatural speed. The thermal signature was wrong, too cold, as if whatever approached had found a way to exist at temperatures that should freeze flesh solid. The figure dropped from shadow into dawn light, and Cody's categorization systems failed completely. She was humanoid, female, wrapped in robes that seemed woven from darkness itself. Her skin was pale as bleached bone, her eyes burning with red luminescence that Cody's pattern recognition software flagged immediately. He had seen eyes like that before, glowing with the particular malevolence of the dark side of the Force. Sith, or close enough that the distinction did not matter. The woman landed between Cody's troopers and the armored man with impossible grace, her boots touching permacrete without sound. She straightened slowly, deliberately, her attention fixed entirely on the massive figure with the sword. "I have searched across this fractured galaxy," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that should not emerge from organic vocal cords. "Through war and ruin, following whispers in the force of a warrior who fights without purpose, who kills without ideology, who survives when survival itself becomes obscene. And I find you here, in this meaningless city, destroying toys while the real battle rages across the stars." The armored man's eye narrowed. "I don't know you. I don't care what you want. Leave." The woman laughed, and the sound carried echoes of screaming that had been refined into something almost musical. "I am Ventress," she said, "servant of Count Dooku, instrument of the dark side, and I have come to offer you purpose." She extended one pale hand, and violet electricity crackled between her fingers, not wild lightning but controlled current, shaped by will and ancient technique into something beautiful and terrible. "The Force calls to those who embrace power without apology," Ventress continued. "Join us. Your hatred is wasted on these mechanical refuse. Turn it toward the Republic, toward the Jedi, toward those who would impose order on a galaxy that was born in chaos." The armored man stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment. Then he raised his massive sword and leveled it at her with the same casual efficiency he had shown the battle droids. "I said leave." Ventress's smile disappeared. The air between them seemed to compress, to darken, as if reality itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. Her hands moved to the curved hilts at her belt, and twin crimson blades ignited with the characteristic snap hiss that had become synonymous with the Sith across a galaxy at war. "Then you will serve as example," she said, "of what becomes of those who refuse Count Dooku's mercy." She moved like lightning given form, her twin lightsabers weaving patterns that left afterimages burned across Cody's retinas. The Form 2 Markashi technique that Count Dooku favored emphasized precision and economy, but Ventress had modified it, adding the aggressive speed of Ataru and the unpredictable angles of Jar-Kai dual-blade combat. She was death-rendered elegant, and she crossed the distance to her target in a blur of crimson light. The massive sword met her first strike with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. Cody's tactical mind, trained to process battlefield data at accelerated speeds, struggled to categorize what he witnessed. The armored man should have been evaporated. Lightsabers cut through durasteel like butter, their plasma blades maintaining coherent form through powerful containment fields generated by kyber crystals and ancient Jedi science. Common metal offered no resistance. Even Beskar, the sacred Mandalorian iron, could only withstand lightsaber strikes for limited duration before molecular bonds failed. But the massive sword held. Sparks exploded where plasma met dark iron, and the blade did not melt, did not glow red with transferred heat, did not part. Ventress's eyes widened fractionally, the only indication of surprise she permitted herself, and then she was moving again, her lightsabers dancing through combinations that should have carved the armored man into component pieces. He met her speed with brutal efficiency, his massive sword moving through guard positions and counterstrikes that belonged to no combat form Cody recognized. There was no elegance in his technique, no wasted motion, but also no artistry. He fought the way tectonic plates collided, with the simple inevitability of mass meeting mass, and somehow his archaic blade continued to turn aside weapons that could cut through blast doors. "Interesting," Ventress said, her voice strained now with actual effort. "The Force surrounds you, permeates you, but you do not touch it. You exist within its currents like a stone in a river, unchanged, unchanging." She punctuated the observation with a strike at his exposed neck, a precision thrust that would have ended most combatants. The armored man twisted, taking the blade on his pauldron, and the scarred metal glowed briefly before the lightsaber withdrew. He reversed his grip on the massive sword and swung in a horizontal arc that forced Ventress to disengage. Her force-enhanced reflexes barely sufficient to avoid being bisected. "I don't need your mysticism," the man growled, "and I don't need your power." He advanced, and for the first time, Cody saw something approaching uncertainty flicker across Ventress's pale features. She was faster, more skilled in conventional terms, her connection to the Force granting her preternatural awareness and reaction speed. But the armored man possessed something that transcended technique, a kind of terrible inevitability, as if he had survived so many battles that defeat itself had become conceptually impossible. Ventress shifted tactics, abandoning direct engagement. She extended both hands and unleashed a telekinetic burst, the Force compressed into a wall of invisible pressure that could crush ribs and rupture organs. The armored man staggered but did not fall. His boots carved furrows in the permacrete as he was driven backward 3 meters. his single eye never leaving her face. He planted his sword and used it as an anchor, halting his momentum through simple mechanical advantage. Then he reached to his belt and produced something that made Cody's tactical systems flag an immediate threat. It was a cannon, absurdly oversized for a handheld weapon, its barrel as thick as a man's thigh. The design was crude, mechanical, relying on explosive propellant rather than Tibanna gas and magnetic acceleration. But the projectile it launched crossed the distance to Ventress at velocities that approximated blaster bolts, a solid slug of metal that would simply pulverize whatever it struck. Ventress gestured, and the slug stopped mid-flight, held suspended by her will, the force compressed around it in invisible fingers. She smiled, triumph flickering across her features. The armored man fired again, and again, and again. 4 more slugs joined the first, their combined mass and momentum overwhelming even her considerable power. The first slug tore free of her telekinetic grip and forced her into a desperate dodge. The second she deflected with a lightsaber strike that sent the metal projectile ricocheting into rubble. The third and fourth required full defensive commitment, her entire focus channeled into survival rather than attack. The massive sword took her in the ribs. Not a killing blow, her force-enhanced awareness had given her just enough warning to twist, to accept the strike on armored ribs rather than exposed organs, but devastating nonetheless. The impact lifted her from her feet and sent her tumbling through space to crash into the rubble 20 meters distant. She rose immediately, her face contorted with fury and pain, one arm cradled against her side. "You dare," she hissed, her voice dropping into registers that resonated with dark side power. "You dare strike at me, at an instrument of Count Dooku's will?" The armored man reloaded his cannon with mechanical precision. "I dare anything I'm strong enough to survive." Ventress raised her hand, and this time the lightning that erupted from her fingertips was not controlled demonstration but raw annihilation. Purple-white current arced across the plaza, ionizing atmosphere, setting rubble ablaze with its passage. It struck the armored man's raised sword and earth through the blade, and Cody's sensors registered electromagnetic discharge sufficient to stop a human heart. The man grunted, his body convulsing, but he did not fall. His hand remained locked around his weapon's grip, his arm muscles straining against the current, and when Ventress finally exhausted herself and let the lightning die, he was still standing. Smoke rose from his armor. The smell of burned flesh drifted across the plaza, but his single eye remained fixed on her with undimmed hatred. "Is that everything?" he asked. Ventress stared at him, and for the first time since Cody had encountered Sith or their servants across this war, he saw something approaching fear cross a dark side adept's face. "What are you?" she whispered. The armored man took one step toward her, then another, his massive sword dragging behind him and carving a furrow in permacrete. Blood seeped from beneath his armor where lightning had found gaps, but his stride remained steady. "Someone who's survived worse than you." Ventress made her decision with the ruthless calculation that had allowed her to survive as Dooku's apprentice. She turned and leaped, the force propelling her upward in a trajectory that took her beyond conventional weapon range, her form disappearing into the ruined towers above. The sound of her retreat echoed briefly, then faded into the ambient noise of distant battle. The armored man watched her go, his posture suggesting he had expected exactly this outcome. Then he turned his attention to Cody and the 8 clone troopers who had maintained disciplined positions throughout the engagement, their weapons trained but not firing, waiting for orders that had not come. "You're still here," the man observed. "We have questions," Cody said. "About what you are, about that weapon, about how you survived Force lightning." The man's scarred face twisted into something too bitter to be called a smile. "Questions. Everyone has questions. What are you? Where did you come from? How are you still alive?" He gestured at the destroyed battle droids surrounding them. These machines had questions too. Didn't make them bulletproof. "I'm not your enemy," Cody said carefully, "but I need to understand what I just witnessed." "You witnessed a fight, I won, that's all the understanding you need." The man turned and began walking away, his massive sword balanced across his shoulders in a carry position that spoke of decades of practice. Cody's tactical computer calculated firing solutions, trajectory patterns that would bring the man down through combined trooper fire, but something about the weary set of those armored shoulders made him hesitate. "Commander," one of his troopers said quietly. "Orders?" Cody watched the armored figure recede into the ruins, leaving a trail of blood drops that glistened darkly against pale permacrete. Above them, the battle for Christophsis continued, Republic and Separatist forces locked in the grinding calculus of war. But something had shifted in this plaza, some essential understanding of what combat could mean when stripped of ideology and prophecy and the Force's supposed will. "Let him go," Cody said finally, "but mark his position. If he engages Republic forces, we neutralize him. If he continues eliminating Separatist assets, we maintain observation distance." "Sir, General Kenobi will want to know about this." Cody nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the point where the armored man had disappeared into shadow. "Yes, he will." The Force shuddered again, a tremor that Cody could not feel but that rippled outward from Christophsis in waves that sensitive Force users across the sector would notice. Something had entered the galaxy that the Force itself struggled to categorize, a presence that existed within its currents but remained fundamentally separate, like a blade thrust into water that emerged dry. And somewhere in the ruins, a man who had known only war continued walking, his hatred burning cold and constant, indifferent to prophecy and the destiny that supposedly governed all things. The twin suns of Christophsis climbed higher, painting the devastation in shades of amber and gold, and the Clone Wars ground forward with mechanical inevitability, unchanged and uncaring. General Obi-Wan Kenobi stood in the holographic war room of the Republic Command Center, his robes still dusted with the fine particulate matter that explosions left in their wake, and listened to Commander Cody's report with the patient attention that had made him one of the Order's most effective negotiators. The blue-tinged hologram showed tactical overlay of Grid Square 87, marking the position where Cody's troopers had encountered the armored stranger, and Kenobi's trained eye immediately noted the pattern of battle droid destruction. "Show me the combat footage again," he said quietly. The recording played at quarter speed, sensor data compiled from multiple trooper perspectives to create a composite view of the engagement. Kenobi watched the massive sword deflect lightsaber strikes, watched primitive ballistic weapons overwhelm Ventress's telekinetic defenses, watched a man survive Force lightning through simple endurance rather than Force resistance. "Fascinating," he murmured. Anakin Skywalker, still wearing his combat armor and radiating the barely contained energy that characterized the Jedi Order's most promising and problematic young knight, leaned forward to study the hologram. Ventress retreated. She never retreats. She calculated her odds of victory and found them unacceptable, Kenobi said. A logical decision, if uncharacteristic of her usual tactics. "Nothing about this is logical, Master. That weapon he's carrying violates basic physics. The mass distribution alone should make it impossible to wield with that kind of speed." Kenobi stroked his beard thoughtfully, a gesture his former Padawan recognized as indicating deep consideration of variables that defied conventional analysis. "The Force moves through all living things, Anakin. But it does not require active manipulation to manifest unusual properties. Some beings are naturally resistant to Force abilities. Others are simply too stubborn to acknowledge that the impossible should limit them. So he's just naturally resistant to lightsabers and Force lightning. That's your analysis?" "I'm saying," Kenobi replied with the slight edge that indicated his patience was being tested, "that we have insufficient data to formulate useful analysis, which is why we're going to find him and have a conversation." Cody had been standing at attention throughout the exchange, his helmet tucked under one arm, his scarred face bearing the kind of exhaustion that 6 months of continuous warfare carved into even the most disciplined soldiers. "Sir, the subject has continued to engage separatist forces. We've tracked 7 additional engagements over the past 4 hours. He's moving toward the southern industrial sector." "The sector we haven't secured yet," Anakin noted. "The one still holding 2 full battalions of battle droids and at least 3 Hailfire-class tanks." "Precisely," Kenobi said. "Which presents an opportunity. Cody, prepare 2 squads for rapid deployment. Anakin, you're with me. Let's see if we can reach our mysterious warrior before he gets himself killed attempting to fight a mechanized army alone." "And if he doesn't want to be reached?" Cody asked. Kenobi's smile held a mixture of confidence and resignation that Anakin had learned to recognize as the expression his former master wore when walking deliberately into situations that would probably involve violence despite best diplomatic intentions. "Then we'll improvise." The southern industrial sector had been built to process raw crystal into refined components for galactic trade, its massive furnaces and cutting facilities designed to handle the unique properties of Christophsis's natural resources. Now those same facilities served as defensive positions for battle droids that had calculated the sector's value and dug in accordingly. The streets between processing plants had become killing fields, their sightlines optimized for interlocking fire patterns that could reduce advancing forces to scrap. Into this tactical nightmare walked a man with a sword. Guts had no name for what this city had been before war consumed it, no context for the architectural grandeur that lay in ruins around him. He understood only that the metal men continued to appear, continued to raise their weapons against him, and therefore continued to die. It was simple, familiar, the only certainty in a reality that had become incomprehensible. He remembered darkness, remembered cold that penetrated beyond flesh into something deeper, more fundamental, remembered the sensation of being torn apart and reassembled according to rules that violated every principle of the world he had known. And then consciousness, sudden and violent, on a planet where 2 suns burned in alien configurations and the very air tasted wrong. Everything here was wrong. The buildings too clean despite their damage, constructed with mathematical precision that his world had never achieved. The sky too blue, unmarred by the smoke of forge fires or the ash of burned cities. Even the enemy was wrong, mechanical constructs following programming rather than the messy biological imperatives of survival and conquest that had defined every battle he had ever fought. But fighting remained fighting. And that was enough. 3 battle droids rounded a corner in standard search formation, their vocabulators chattering target acquisition protocols in mechanical harmony. Guts moved before they could fire, the Dragon Slayer rising in a vertical slash that bisected the lead droid and continued upward to catch the second across its central processing unit. The third managed to trigger its blaster, blue bolts scorching across Guts's pauldron, before the massive sword reversed and took it in a horizontal sweep that scattered components across 15 meters. Pain bloomed where blaster fire had found gaps in his armor. The wounds were superficial, already clotting, but they added to the collection that covered his body in layers of old scars and new damage. Good. Pain was proof of continued existence, evidence that he remained sufficiently alive to feel his body's deterioration. He pressed forward into the industrial sector, following no strategy beyond the simple imperative to continue fighting until the enemy was destroyed or he was dead. Behind him, the bodies of battle droids formed a trail that marked his passage with mechanical precision. Ahead, more metal men emerged from defensive positions, their sensors painting him as priority target, their simple programming sufficient to recognize threat level even if it could not comprehend what they faced. A sound reached him then, cutting through the ambient noise of distant explosions and mechanical vocabulator chatter, the high-pitched whine of repulsor lifts approaching fast from his 6 o'clock position. Guts turned, the Dragon Slayer coming up in guard position, and saw two military transports descending in combat approach patterns. The vessels were smaller than the ones the first soldiers had arrived in, sleeker, designed for speed rather than heavy assault. They touched down 30 meters from his position, their boarding ramps dropping even before landing gear compressed fully against permacrete. Figures emerged, more men in white armor, but these moved with a fluidity that the earlier soldiers had lacked, and in their center walked two individuals whose bearing immediately identified them as different. The younger one wore robes over armor, his right hand resting casually near a cylindrical object at his belt. The older one stepped forward with the kind of deliberate calm that Guts had learned to recognize in truly dangerous opponents, not the bravado of warriors who had never faced real defeat, but the quiet confidence of someone who had survived enough battles to understand combat's true cost. "That's far enough," the older man said, his voice carrying authority without volume. "We're not here to fight you." Guts kept the Dragon Slayer raised. "Then leave." "I'm afraid I can't do that. My name is Obi-Wan Kenobi, General in the Army of the Republic. This is Anakin Skywalker. We witnessed your engagement with Asajj Ventress, and we have questions." "Everyone has questions," Guts said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper than simple fatigue. "No one has answers worth hearing." The younger one, Anakin, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, and Guts recognized the minute adjustment of a fighter preparing to move explosively. But the older man raised one hand in a gesture that seemed to carry more weight than simple body language should permit. "We may have answers," Kenobi said. "But first, I need to understand what you are. That weapon you carry, it resisted a lightsaber. That shouldn't be possible." "A lot of things that shouldn't be possible are," Guts replied. "I'm one of them." Behind the two robed figures, battle droids were regrouping, their sensors identifying multiple targets in the industrial sector's open ground. Vocabulators chattered tactical assessments, and heavy weapons platforms began rotating toward the cluster of organic signatures that had presented themselves with tactically inadvisable exposure. "Incoming," the white-armored leader said sharply. 7 battle droids, 2 super battle droids, closing from the northwest. We need to move to cover. "Or," Anakin said, and there was something dangerous in his voice, something that resonated with the kind of controlled fury that Guts had spent years mastering. "We end this quickly." The young warrior's hand moved to his belt and drew the cylindrical object in a motion too fast to track clearly. A blade of pure blue light erupted from the cylinder's end, crackling with contained energy that made the air itself shimmer. He moved forward in a blur of motion, covering 30 meters before the battle droids could acquire target lock, and his glowing blade carved through geranium chassis with the same effortless precision Guts had witnessed in the pale woman's crimson weapons. Kenobi sighed a sound that managed to convey both exasperation and deep affection, and drew his own light weapon. His blade burned blue-white, and he advanced with very different technique than his companion. Where Anakin moved with aggressive speed, Kenobi flowed like water finding its level, his blade intercepting blaster bolts and redirecting their energy back toward the droids that had fired them. It was beautiful in its way, economical, each motion serving multiple purposes, offense and defense woven together in a combat style that spoke of decades of refinement. Guts had seen master swordsmen before Judo's speed, Serpico's precision, Skull Knight's inevitability, but these warriors fought with weapons and techniques beyond anything his world had produced. And still they bled. Anakin took a glancing hit from a super battle droid's sustained burst, his shoulder smoking as he twisted away, and retaliated with a rising slash that bisected the mechanical opponent. Kenobi's guard slipped fractionally under concentrated fire, forcing him to retreat 2 steps and reset his defensive stance. They were good, perhaps better than good, but they were not invincible. Guts made his decision and charged. The Dragon Slayer caught the nearest battle droid mid-torso and carved it in half with the familiar resistance of metal parting under irresistible force. He continued the motion into a horizontal sweep that eliminated 2 more droids, his momentum building, his body falling into the rhythm that had sustained him through 1,000 battlefields. Pain receded, thought simplified. There was only the enemy and the blade and the eternal now of combat. A super battle droid tracked him with heavy cannons, firing at point-blank range. Guts took the hits on his chest plate, feeling ribs crack from the kinetic impact, and drove forward. The Dragon Slayer rose and fell like a hammer, and the super battle droid joined its lesser cousins in mechanical death. "By the Force," he heard Anakin say, the words carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Did you see that? He just walked through sustained fire like it was rain." Kenobi's response was quieter, more measured. "I saw, but look at the cost." Guts stood amid the destroyed droids, his chest heaving, blood seeping from 6 new wounds that added to the constellation of damage his body had accumulated. The pain was good, familiar. It meant he was still alive, still capable of continuing the only purpose he understood. But when he tried to take another step forward, his leg buckled. Not from weakness, his body had carried him through far worse, but from simple accumulated damage. There were limits, even to what endurance could sustain, and 6 hours of continuous combat had finally brought him to the edge of that precipice. He caught himself on the Dragon Slayer, using the massive blade as a crutch, and prepared to rise again, to continue, to fight until the enemy was destroyed or he was dead, because those were the only 2 outcomes that made sense in a senseless galaxy. Kenobi approached slowly, his light blade extinguished and replaced at his belt. His hands were empty, raised in a gesture of non-aggression that Guts had seen too many times to trust. "You're injured," the Jedi said. "Badly. Without medical attention, you'll die." "So?" Guts managed through gritted teeth. "So we can help. The Republic has medical facilities, Bacta tanks that can heal damage that would kill most humans. Let us help you." "Why?" It was Anakin who answered, stepping forward with the kind of reckless directness that made Kenobi wince. "Because anyone who can make Ventress run deserves better than bleeding out in a ruined city. Because you fought beside us, whether you meant to or not, and because I want to know how you did what you did." Guts stared at them both, his single eye moving between the older warrior's calm patience and the younger one's barely controlled energy. In another life, he might have recognized something familiar in their dynamic master and student, experience and raw talent, the generational transmission of skill and knowledge. But that life was gone, consumed along with everything else he had known. "I don't need saving," he said. "No," Kenobi agreed. "You don't, but you need rest, you need healing. And unless I'm very mistaken, you need answers about where you are and how you arrived here." The words struck deeper than blaster bolts. Guts had been avoiding that question, focusing on immediate combat because combat was comprehensible. But the larger mystery remained this alien world, these strange weapons, the fundamental wrongness of a reality that should not exist. One day he heard himself say, "I'll take your help for one day, then I'm gone." Kenobi smiled, and there was genuine warmth in the expression. "One day is a start. Cody, call for medical transport, and have them bring restraints, just in case our new friend changes his mind about cooperation." "I heard that," Guts growled. "You were meant to," Kenobi replied. The medical frigate Salvation maintained orbit above Christophsis, its hull painted with the red sigil that marked it as non-combatant under Republic and Separatist convention both. The agreement was frequently violated. The Clone Wars had eroded most principles of civilized warfare, but the symbol still carried enough weight to grant the vessel relative safety while it processed casualties from the surface battle. Guts regained consciousness in a Bacta tank, his body suspended in translucent gel that smelled faintly of chemicals his damaged sense could not identify. Breathing apparatus covered his nose and mouth, forcing oxygen into his lungs while the healing medium worked on injuries that the medical droids had catalogued with mechanical efficiency. 14 blaster wounds, 6 of them deep enough to compromise organ function, 17 fractured ribs, hairline fractures in both femurs, second-degree burns across 40% of his body surface. Damage consistent with force lightning exposure. He was alive. The realization brought neither relief nor particular satisfaction. He had been alive after the eclipse, after Casca's breaking, after the conviction, after each impossible survival that should have ended in death but somehow hadn't. Living was simply what he did, a stubborn refusal to grant the universe the satisfaction of his extinction. Through the Bacta's distortion, he could see figures moving beyond the tank's transparasteel walls. The medical droids, their multiple limbs adjusting settings and monitoring data feeds with tireless precision. The white-armored soldiers standing guard, their weapons held ready but not actively threatening. And the robed man Kenobi seated in a chair beside the tank, reading something on a datapad while maintaining the patient vigil of someone who had waited at many bedsides. Guts tried to move and found his limbs unresponsive. Not paralyzed, the Bacta medium simply made motion difficult, like trying to run through deep water. He could break free if necessary, could shatter the transparasteel and fight his way clear, but the effort would undo whatever healing had occurred and leave him worse than before. He forced himself to stillness and waited. Time passed. Minutes or hours, impossible to tell in the tank's suspended existence. Eventually, the medical droids signaled completion of their protocols and began draining the Bacta. The thick gel receded slowly, lowering Guts until his feet touched the tank's floor. Restraints released from his wrists and ankles, he had not noticed them before, and the breathing apparatus detached with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The tank's door opened, and Kenobi stood waiting with a towel and a set of clothing that looked nothing like Guts's familiar armor. "Welcome back," the Jedi said. "How do you feel?" Guts stepped out of the tank, his legs steady despite hours of suspension, and took the offered towel. He dried himself methodically, examining his body for the damage he knew should be there. The wounds were gone. Not scarred over, not merely healed, but absent as if they had never existed. Even burns from the pale woman's lightning had faded to faint discoloration that would disappear entirely in another day. "What did you do to me?" he asked. "Bacta immersion therapy," Kenobi explained. "A medical technique using organic compounds and synthetic additives to accelerate cellular regeneration. The process is well established, though it works better on some species than others. You, apparently, respond quite well." Guts touched his ribs, feeling the bones solid and whole beneath muscle and skin. "Where's my armor?" "Being cleaned and repaired. Your sword is in secure storage. You'll have them both returned once we've had that conversation I mentioned." It was not a threat, not exactly, but the implication was clear. Cooperation in exchange for returned property. Guts had played this game before, in mercenary camps and noble courts, and he knew the shapes it could take. "Fine. Talk." Kenobi gestured to the clothing he had brought, simple pants and a tunic made from fabric that felt strange against Guts's skin, too smooth, lacking the coarse texture of wool or leather. "Get dressed first. Then we'll adjourn somewhere more comfortable than a medical bay." The conference room was small, designed for tactical briefings rather than formal meetings, with a circular table that could project holographic displays from its center. Kenobi had dismissed the guards, leaving only himself, Anakin, and Commander Cody present when Guts entered, wearing the borrowed clothing and carrying himself with the wary tension of someone who expected violence to resume at any moment. They sat. Kenobi poured water from a carafe into simple plasteel cups and slid one across the table to Guts, who ignored it. "Let's start with basics," Kenobi said. "Your name?" "Guts." Anakin blinked. "That's your actual name, not a call sign or nickname." "It's what I'm called." "All right," Kenobi continued smoothly. "Where are you from, Guts?" The question touched the wound, that Bacta could not heal. Guts stared at the wall behind Kenobi's head, seeing instead the streets of Midland, the fields of Doldry, the corpses stacked high enough to blot out the sun. "Somewhere that doesn't exist anymore," he said finally. "A destroyed world?" Cody asked, his scarred face showing the professional sympathy of someone who had seen too many civilized planets reduced to rubble. "Separatist bombardment? No, just gone, replaced by this." The three Republic officers exchanged glances that Guts had learned to interpret concern, calculation, the assessment of whether they were dealing with combat trauma or something more fundamental. "Guts," Kenobi said carefully, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you know where you are? Not just this ship, but what system, what sector of space? No. Do you know what year it is by any calendar? No. Do you remember how you arrived on Christophsis?" Guts closed his eye, reaching back through fragmented memory toward the last moment of coherent existence before the transition. The Berserker armor, its cursed mechanisms flooding his body with strength beyond human limitation, the beast of darkness. That manifestation of his own accumulated hatred, surging toward final consumption of what remained of his humanity. Darkness closing in from all sides. And then, "I remember dying," he said, "or close enough." Anakin leaned forward, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado and taking on genuine curiosity. "But you didn't die. You're here." So something intervened. Something powerful enough to pull you back from whatever edge you were on and transport you across the galaxy. "The Force," Kenobi murmured. "It must have been the Force." Guts opened his eye and stared at the Jedi with flat rejection. "I told the Pale Woman, and I'm telling you I don't need mysticism. I don't believe in destiny or higher powers or any philosophy that tries to explain why things happen beyond simple cause and effect. And yet," Kenobi pressed gently, "you're here. Against all probability, you exist in a galaxy that should have been completely foreign to you, speaking a language you should not know, wielding a weapon that defies physical laws, surviving injuries that should have killed you. At some point, skepticism becomes its own form of denial." The words struck something deep, some truth that Guts had been avoiding since consciousness returned. He had spent years denying the supernatural, rejecting Shirka's assertion that destiny governed all things, refusing to acknowledge the idea of evil that the brand had shown him. But denial had not made the impossible less real. It had not prevented the eclipse, had not saved Casca, had not stopped his transformation into the very monster he had sworn to destroy. "Tell me about the Force," he said finally. Kenobi settled back in his chair, adopting the posture of a teacher preparing to deliver familiar lecture. "The Force is an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, binds the galaxy together. Some individuals are born with the ability to sense it, to manipulate it in ways that appear supernatural to those without such sensitivity. Like your light swords," Guts said. "Lightsabers," Anakin corrected. "And yes, the blade is generated through kyber crystals that focus the Force, but the weapon requires Force sensitivity to construct and wield properly. It's as much a connection to the Force as it is a physical object. But the Force has another aspect," Kenobi continued, and his voice took on a darker timbre. "It exists in balance, or should. There is the light side, patience, compassion, selflessness, and there is the dark side, anger, fear, aggression. The Jedi Order has spent millennia maintaining that balance, preventing those who would abuse the dark side's power from consuming the galaxy. Like the Pale Woman, like Asajj Ventress. Yes, she serves Count Dooku, who was once a Jedi Master but fell to the dark side and now leads the Separatist alliance against the Republic. This war we're fighting, the Clone Wars, is fundamentally a conflict between those who would preserve peace and order through the light side and those who would impose their will through power and fear. Guts laughed, a sound without humor that made all three Republic officers stiffen. So you're the good ones, they're the bad ones, and the war is about choosing the right mysticism. I've heard this story before. It always ends the same way. And how is that? Kenobi asked. Everyone dies. The good, the bad, the ones who thought they were above it all. Death doesn't care about your philosophy. Cody spoke for the first time since the conversation began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen the philosophy tested in brutal reality. He's not entirely wrong, General. We've lost good men to this war. Men who believed in the Republic, who fought for something larger than themselves. Belief doesn't make you bulletproof. No, Kenobi agreed quietly. It doesn't, but it gives purpose to the sacrifice. It transforms violence from simple destruction into something that can build a better future. Or it's just a story you tell yourself, Guts said, to make killing easier. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Anakin broke it with the kind of blunt directness that made Kenobi wince. So, what's your story? What do you tell yourself to make it easier? Guts met the young Jedi's eyes and saw something there. He recognized the barely controlled fury, the darkness held in check through discipline and will, the constant war between power and conscience. I don't tell myself anything, Guts said. I just survive. They talked for hours, the conversation ranging across topics that should have required cultural context Guts did not possess but somehow understood anyway. The language itself was wrong, not the tongue he had spoken in Midland, yet comprehensible, as if the transition that had brought him to this place had written new knowledge directly into his mind. The technological concepts should have been incomprehensible to someone whose world had barely mastered gunpowder, yet he grasped them with the same instinctive clarity. Kenobi explained the Republic, a democratic government spanning thousands of worlds that had endured for 1,000 years before fracturing into civil war. He described the Jedi Order, warrior monks who served as peacekeepers and negotiators, their abilities granted by connection to the Force. He outlined the Separatist Alliance, a coalition of corporate interests and disillusioned systems led by Count Dooku and his mysterious master, and he explained the Clone Wars, a conflict 6 months old that had already consumed millions of lives and showed no sign of ending. The clones are created on Kamino, Kenobi said, gesturing to Cody. Genetically identical soldiers grown from the template of a bounty hunter named Jango Fett. They're bred for warfare, conditioned to follow orders and protect the Republic. Guts looked at Cody with new understanding. You're not natural born. No, Cody said without apparent shame or resentment. I was created for this war, as were my brothers. 200,000 of us in the first deployment, millions more being grown as we speak. Doesn't that bother you, being made just to die? We all die, Guts. The difference is that we die for something worth preserving. There was that word again, worth. As if meaning could be assigned to violence, as if purpose could transform slaughter into nobility. Guts had believed in such things once, when he had followed Griffith and dreamed of earning a place among legends. That belief had died screaming at the eclipse. Your weapon, Anakin said, shifting the conversation. That massive sword. I've never seen metal resist a lightsaber like that. What is it made from? Steel, iron, dragon's blood, if you believe the smith who forged it. Dragon's blood, Anakin repeated flatly. You're joking. I'm not, but I don't know if the smith was. All I know is the blade has killed things that shouldn't die and survived impacts that should shatter it. Kenobi stroked his beard thoughtfully. The Force can imbue objects with unusual properties, especially if they're created with intention or used by individuals with strong Force presence. Your sword may have absorbed something during its creation or use that makes it resistant to energy weapons. Or it's just well-made steel that happens to be strong enough. Occam's razor, Kenobi said with a slight smile. The simplest explanation is usually correct, though in a galaxy where the Force exists, simplicity becomes relative. The conversation continued until exhaustion finally claimed even Guts' endurance. Kenobi offered quarters aboard the Salvation, a small cabin with basic amenities and a door that locked from the inside. It was not imprisonment, not quite, but the implication remained: stay here, cooperate, and they would continue to help. Resist, and the situation would change. Guts accepted because he needed time to heal fully, to understand this strange galaxy, to plan his next move. The Bacta had repaired damage, but his body still ached with the deep fatigue that came from pushing past every limit. Rest was tactical necessity, not weakness. He slept for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, and his dreams were full of eclipses and brands and the laughter of something wearing Griffith's face. He woke to alarms screaming through the ship's corridors. Guts rolled from the narrow bunk with reflexes born from years of sleeping in hostile territory, his hand reaching for the Dragon Slayer before remembering it was in storage. The borrowed clothing offered no protection, no familiar weight of armor to orient himself, and for a moment he felt naked in a way that had nothing to do with fabric. The cabin door opened before he reached it, revealing Cody in full combat gear, his helmet under one arm and his scarred face tight with professional concern. "Separatist attack," the clone commander said tersely. 3 frigates just dropped out of hyperspace and began bombardment of the medical convoy. We need to evacuate to the surface. My equipment. Already being loaded on the transport, General Kenobi insisted. Let's move. The corridors had transformed into organized chaos. Medical personnel and clone troopers moving with practiced efficiency toward evacuation stations while the ship shuddered under impacts that sent sympathetic vibrations through every bulkhead. Guts followed Cody through passages that twisted in configurations his spatial sense struggled to map, descended in lift tubes that dropped so quickly his stomach lurched, and finally emerged in a hangar bay where the familiar low-altitude transports waited with boarding ramps deployed. Kenobi and Anakin stood near the closest transport, their robes whipping in the wind generated by atmospheric containment field failure. Both held their lightsabers ignited, the blue blades casting strange shadows across deck plating that buckled from impact somewhere above. "Guts," Kenobi called over the noise. "Your armor and weapon are inside. Get equipped and strap in. This is going to be a rough descent." Guts boarded the transport and found his equipment secured in the cargo bay exactly as promised. The Berserker armor waited in its familiar configuration, the black metal seeming to absorb the transport's harsh utility lighting. The Dragon Slayer rested beside it, the massive blade clean of the blood and carbon scoring it had accumulated during surface combat. He donned the armor with the automatic movements of ritual, feeling each plate settle into place like pieces of his identity being restored. The helm came last, its narrow vision slit reducing his field of view but providing protection that had saved him countless times. The Dragon Slayer's familiar weight settled across his shoulders, and for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, he felt almost whole. The transport lifted off even as he was securing himself in a jump seat designed for smaller men, his armored bulk barely fitting in the restraints. Through the open bay doors, he could see the Salvation breaking apart under sustained fire, its hull breaching in expanding flowers of atmosphere and debris. Smaller craft scattered from its hangar bays like seeds from a dying flower, each carrying precious cargo of wounded soldiers and medical personnel. 30 seconds to atmosphere, the pilot announced. Brace for evasive action. The transport dove toward Christophsis's upper atmosphere with acceleration that pressed Guts back into his seat hard enough to stress the restraints. Outside, space filled with tracer, fire, and explosions as separatist fighters moved to intercept the evacuating vessels. Several transports disintegrated under concentrated fire, their passenger compartments exposed to vacuum for the brief moments before complete structural failure. Their transport jinked hard left, then right, the pilot executing maneuvers that seemed to violate basic physics. Guts felt his stomach lurch again, tasted bile, and forced it down through sheer will. Beside him, Cody maintained the same calm expression he had worn during groundside combat, as if death from above carried no more weight than death from blaster fire. The transport hit atmosphere at velocities that turned its hull into a meteor, friction superheating the outer plating until it glowed red-orange against Christophsis's morning sky. The pilot maintained the dive, sacrificing altitude for speed, racing ahead of the explosions that bloomed behind them as other vessels failed to outrun pursuing fighters. 20 seconds to landing zone, the pilot said. Enemy ground forces detected. This is going to be hot. The transport leveled out barely 50 meters above Christophsis's surface, its repulsor lifts screaming protest, and arrowed toward a predetermined landing zone that tactical sensors identified as already under fire. Below, Guts could see battle droids in formation, their weapons tracking skyward, preparing to turn the landing zone into a killing field. "Deploy now," Cody ordered. The side doors blew off on explosive charges, transforming the transport's interior into a wind tunnel. Clone troopers poured out in textbook combat drops, their jetpacks firing to control descent, their weapons already tracking targets before boots touched ground. Guts released his restraints, stood, and looked down at the 50-meter drop to hard permacrete and waiting battle droids. "You don't have a jetpack," Anakin shouted over the wind. Guts stepped off the ramp. The fall lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to feel gravity's acceleration, to see the ground rushing up to meet him, to calculate impact velocity and know that even his armor might not absorb the kinetic energy. But he had survived worse, had fallen further, had learned that the human body could endure impacts that should pulverize bone if will was sufficient to ignore what should and should not be possible. He hit the permacrete in a crouch, the Dragon Slayer planted point first beside him, and the impact cratered the ground in a circle 3 meters wide. Pain exploded through his legs, his spine, his skull, every bone in his body reporting damage in screaming chorus. But the armor held, the bones held, he held. Battle droids swiveled to target this new threat, their vocabulators processing the tactical absurdity of a single combatant dropping from 50 meters and surviving. Guts rose from the crater, pulled the Dragon Slayer free, and charged. The first droid died before its targeting computer could establish firing solution. The second and third followed in rapid succession, their chassis carved apart by a blade that moved too fast for their sensors to track. Guts felt the familiar rhythm settling over him, the combat fugue that reduced reality to simple vectors of attack and defense, the meditation of violence that was the only peace he had ever known. Above, the transport completed its combat drop and climbed back toward relative safety, its cargo of clone troopers establishing a defensive perimeter on the ground. Kenobi and Anakin descended with Force-assisted jumps, their lightsabers igniting in midair, and joined the expanding battle with the synchronized efficiency of warriors who had fought together long enough to anticipate each other's movements. But Guts fought alone, as he always had, the Dragon Slayer carving through enemy formations like a farmer's scythe through wheat. The droids adapted, attempting to establish crossfire patterns and concentration of force, but adaptation required time, and Guts granted them none. He moved through their lines with the inevitability of an avalanche, leaving destruction in his wake. "By the Force," he heard Anakin say, the young Jedi's voice carrying admiration tinged with something darker. "He fights like he's trying to kill the entire galaxy." Kenobi's response was quieter, more thoughtful. "Or like he already has." The battle for Christophsis's southern sector lasted 3 days and ended with Republic victory at a cost that left even the most optimistic strategic assessments subdued. The Separatist forces withdrew to positions beyond the city limits, ceding control of the crystal processing facilities but maintaining enough military presence to threaten renewed offensive. The clone army consolidated its gains, established defensive perimeters, and began the grinding work of occupation and pacification. Guts participated in 17 separate engagements during those 3 days, each time appearing where fighting was thickest and disappearing once the enemy was destroyed. He did not coordinate with Republic forces, did not report to chain of command, did not acknowledge tactical briefings or strategic objectives. He simply fought, his massive sword rising and falling with mechanical regularity, and the battle droids fell before him in windrows. The clone troopers began calling him the Black Swordsman, the name spreading through the ranks with the speed of effective mythology. Some claimed he was a secret Jedi weapon, others that he was a mercenary hired by Republic intelligence. A few whispered that he was something else, entirely a ghost, a demon, a manifestation of war itself given crude flesh and terrible purpose. Kenobi watched the phenomenon with the careful attention of someone who understood that legends could be as dangerous as any weapon, and arranged another meeting on the 4th day after the Separatist withdrawal. They met in what had once been a merchant's residence, its crystalline architecture somehow surviving the battle intact. The rooms had been converted to temporary Republic headquarters, tactical displays replacing decorative artwork, military efficiency imposing itself over civilian comfort. Kenobi waited in what had been a dining room, seated at a table that could have hosted 20 guests but now held only datapads and holographic projectors. Guts entered still wearing his armor, the Berserker's black metal dulled by carbon scoring and impact damage. He had not removed it since the evacuation from the Salvation, had slept in it when exhaustion finally claimed him, had worn it so long that it felt more natural than his own skin. "Sit," Kenobi invited. "Please." Guts remained standing. "Very well." Kenobi set aside the datapad he had been reviewing and gave Guts his full attention. "I've been analyzing your combat performance over the past 72 hours. Do you know what I've concluded? That I'm useful." "That you're suicidal," Kenobi corrected gently. "You fight with complete disregard for personal safety, taking injuries that would incapacitate most warriors and continuing until the enemy is destroyed or you collapse from blood loss. That's not combat effectiveness, that's a death wish. So I'm concerned about you and about what happens if you continue this pattern. The Separatists are already adapting their tactics to account for your presence. They're deploying heavier weapons, concentrating fire, attempting to overwhelm you through simple attrition. Eventually, they'll succeed." Guts shrugged, the motion making his armor creak. "Then, I'll die. What does it matter to you?" Kenobi stood and approached until he was close enough that Guts could have killed him with a single sword thrust. The Jedi showed no fear, only a kind of weary compassion that Guts found more unsettling than threats would have been. "It matters," Kenobi said, "because I've seen too many good people destroyed by war, because you deserve better than to die in a ruined city fighting an enemy you don't care about in a war that isn't yours, and because I think, despite everything you've survived, you still want something more than endless combat. You don't know anything about me. I know you could have left at any time, stolen a ship, disappeared into the galaxy, found some quiet world where this war hasn't reached, but you're still here, still fighting. Why?" The question cut deeper than Guts wanted to acknowledge. He had asked himself the same thing during brief intervals between battles, when exhaustion permitted thought beyond immediate survival. Why was he still here? Why continue fighting when the enemy meant nothing to him, when victory or defeat in this alien war carried no personal stakes? Because fighting was all he knew. Because without an enemy to destroy, the darkness inside him would turn inward and consume what little remained of his humanity. Because moving forward, even into meaningless violence, was better than standing still and confronting what he had become. "I have nowhere else to go," he said finally. Kenobi nodded as if he had expected exactly that answer. "Then let me offer you somewhere. Join us. formally as a Republic operative or a Special Forces asset or simply as an ally. Let us give your fighting purpose beyond simple survival. I told you before I don't believe in your cause. I'm not asking you to believe. I'm asking you to choose. Between dying alone in a war that will forget you before your body cools, or living long enough to find something worth fighting for. The Force shuddered again, the tremor Guts could not feel, but that manifested in the way Kenobi's expression shifted, his eyes focusing on something beyond physical sight. Ventress is returning, the Jedi said quietly. I can sense her approach, and she's not alone this time. She's bringing an army. Good, Guts said, his hand moving to the Dragon Slayer's grip. I have unfinished business with her. This isn't about personal vendetta. If the Separatists commit forces to Christophsis in strength, we'll be outnumbered 3-1. We need every advantage, every warrior, every weapon we can bring to bear. Kenobi extended his hand, offering alliance through the simple human gesture that transcended cultures and species across the galaxy. Fight with us, Guts. Just this once. And if you still want to walk away when it's over, I won't stop you. Guts stared at the offered hand, seeing in it all the complications he had spent years avoiding. Alliance meant obligation, cooperation meant trust. Trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability led to the eclipse, to betrayal, to watching everything he cared about consumed by the ambitions of someone he had followed too blindly. But he had come to this galaxy with nothing, no purpose, no direction, only the Dragon Slayer and the hatred that had sustained him through impossible survival. If this Jedi wanted to point that hatred at an enemy, give it target and focus, perhaps that was enough. He took Kenobi's hand. The Separatist assault began at dawn, when Christophsis's twin suns painted the eastern sky in shades of crimson that reminded Guts too much of the brand burning in moments of supernatural danger. The attack came not as probing action or limited offensive, but as full-scale invasion, dropships descending through the atmosphere in such numbers that they briefly eclipsed the sun's light. Republic forces had prepared defensive positions throughout the southern sector. Clone troopers dug in behind hastily erected barricades, artillery pieces sighted to cover approach vectors, mine fields deployed in carefully calculated patterns. The tactical assessment suggested they could hold for perhaps 6 hours before being overwhelmed through simple mathematics: too many enemies, not enough defenders, insufficient ammunition to sustain prolonged engagement. But the Republic had advantages beyond conventional force calculations. Anakin Skywalker stood on a crystalline tower overlooking the main approach, his blue lightsaber ignited, his presence in the Force burning like a beacon that drew dark-side attention the way blood drew predators. Beside him, his Padawan Ahsoka Tano, a young Togruta, whose head-tails and montrals marked her as barely into adolescence despite her combat training, maintained watch over a different vector, her own lightsaber ready. Kenobi commanded from the central position, coordinating clone battalions with the calm efficiency that had earned him the nickname the Negotiator, even as his combat prowess made that title seem inadequate. And Guts waited in the ruins beyond the defensive perimeter, hidden among rubble that had once been merchant stalls and civilian housing, his black armor rendering him nearly invisible against shadow and carbon-scored stone. The dropships touched down in designated landing zones, their boarding ramps dropping to disgorge battle droids in formations that spoke of competent tactical programming. But the droids were not the true threat. Behind them, moving with terrible purpose, came the organic commander's Neimoidian officers coordinating from armored command vehicles, Geonosian elites wielding sonic weapons, and figures wrapped in dark robes whose Force presence announced their allegiance more clearly than any banner. Ventress descended from a command ship at the assault center, her pale face composed in an expression of cold fury. She had brought dark-side acolytes with her, lesser students of Count Dooku's teachings, who compensated for lack of skill with fanatical dedication and willingness to die for their master's vision. The battle began with artillery exchange, Republic cannons targeting landing zones, while Separatist positions returned fire with heavier weapons that could reduce fortified positions to rubble. The mathematics of destruction played out in expanding circles of devastation, each side calculating optimal trajectories and acceptable losses with mechanical precision. Then Ventress gestured, and her acolytes charged. They moved with force-enhanced speed, closing the distance to Republic lines faster than conventional tactics could accommodate, their lightsabers igniting in a wave of crimson light that reminded Guts of the eclipse's horror. Clone troopers opened fire, their training allowing them to target Force users with acceptable accuracy, but the dark side adepts deflected most blaster bolts and accepted the remainder as acceptable cost. Anakin met them at the perimeter. The young Jedi moved like lightning given purpose, his blue blade carving through defensive guards that would have stopped lesser warriors. His technique was aggressive, relentless, each strike flowing into the next with minimal pause for recovery, the momentum of violence sustained through connection to the Force and sheer determination. 2 acolytes fell in the first 10 seconds, their inadequate training exposed when confronted with a Jedi who fought with controlled fury. But Ventress had not sent her students to win. She had sent them to die. Their deaths released dark side energy in expanding waves, their final moments channeled through Sith techniques that transformed death into weapon. The accumulated rage and fear and hatred washed over Republic positions like toxic tide, disrupting concentration, seeding doubt, making disciplined soldiers question orders that should have been followed reflexively. Guts felt it even without Force sensitivity, the psychic weight of violent death, familiar and terrible, exactly like the presence of apostles manifesting in his old world. The brand burned cold against his neck, responding to supernatural malevolence even in this alien galaxy, and he knew with absolute certainty that what approached was not human in any meaningful sense. He left his hiding place and began to run. The Dragon Slayer rose and fell, its familiar weight grounding him against the psychic assault, each swing a rejection of fear and doubt, and every emotion beyond focused violence. Battle droids appeared in his path and died without slowing his advance. A Geonosian elite targeted him with sonic weaponry that could liquefy organs, and the Dragon Slayer's arc took the alien in a rising cut that silenced the weapon permanently. Ahead, through the smoke and chaos, Guts saw Ventress standing atop a ruined vehicle, her twin lightsabers extended, her Force presence darkening the air around her like a stain. She saw him at the same moment and smiled. "The Black Swordsman," she said, her voice cutting through battlefield noise with unnatural clarity. "I wondered if you would survive long enough for our second meeting. You should have accepted my offer. Count Dooku would have treasured a weapon like you." Guts closed the distance without responding, the Dragon Slayer rising for an overhead strike that would split her skull if it connected. Ventress intercepted with crossed lightsabers, the crimson blades creating an X that caught his massive sword and held it in place through telekinetic enhancement. "You fight like a beast," she observed, her red eyes studying him with clinical interest. "All rage, no technique. Impressive against droids, but I am no machine." She twisted, redirecting his momentum, and followed with a strike at his exposed side. The lightsaber scored across his armor, heating metal to temperatures that would melt flesh. But the Berserker's cursed construction channeled pain into fuel rather than allowing it to slow him. Guts reversed his grip and drove the Dragon Slayer's pommel toward her face. Ventress dodged back, creating space, and unleashed Force lightning with both hands. The purple-white current earthed through Guts's armor and blade, making every nerve scream protest, but he had survived this before, had learned that lightning could be endured if will was absolute. He advanced through the current, step by deliberate step, the Dragon Slayer raised in guard position. Ventress poured more power into the lightning, her face contorting with effort, but physics and endurance favored the warrior who could simply refuse to fall. The distance closed to striking range. The Dragon Slayer descended in an arc that would cleave her in half. Ventress released the lightning and threw herself backward in a force-assisted leap that took her 20 meters away in a single bound. "Remarkable," she said, breathing hard now, her pale skin sheened with sweat despite the cool morning air. "You should be dead. Burned from within." Your heart stopped. Your brain boiled in its own fluids. Yet, you continue. "How?" "Stubbornness," Guts said, and charged again. They fought across the ruined landscape, two warriors who represented entirely different understandings of combat. Ventress moved with elegant precision, her Jarkai technique refined through years of study under Count Dooku's demanding tutelage. She struck at joints and weak points, targeted nerve clusters and blood vessels, fought with the calculated efficiency of someone who understood anatomy and leverage. Guts fought like an avalanche. Each swing of the Dragon Slayer carried enough kinetic energy to shatter stone, and he accepted hits that would incapacitate normal humans in exchange for positioning that allowed devastating counterstrikes. His armor absorbed lightsaber glances that would have killed him instantly without protection. His endurance outlasted her. Force-enhanced stamina simply by refusing to acknowledge that exhaustion should matter. Around them, the larger battle continued. Clone troopers held defensive positions against droid waves, their weapons fire creating a constant backdrop of destruction. Anakin battled the remaining dark side acolytes, his aggressive technique overwhelming their numbers through sheer ferocity. Kenobi coordinated from his command position, directing artillery strikes and tactical repositions with the calm authority of someone who had fought 100 battles and knew exactly how this one would unfold. But in the space between Guts and Ventress, the only thing that mattered was the simple question of who would survive. Ventress began to falter first. Her breathing grew labored, her strikes less precise, the accumulated cost of maintaining force enhancement and active combat beginning to exceed what her body could sustain. She attempted to disengage, to create space for recovery, but Guts granted her nothing. The Dragon Slayer caught her left lightsaber in a bind that trapped the blade against his sword's crossguard. Ventress tried to wrench free, her other lightsaber striking at his exposed neck, but he simply continued the motion and ripped the weapon from her grip through superior strength. The lightsaber flew through the air and deactivated as it left her hand. She was left with one blade against a man who had learned to kill gods. "Yield," Guts said. Not because he cared whether she surrendered, but because the word itself was an assertion of victory, a declaration that her defeat had become inevitable. Ventress's red eyes blazed with fury and something that might have been fear if she had permitted herself such weakness. "I am the apprentice of Count Dooku. I do not yield to anyone." She attacked with renewed desperation, her single lightsaber moving through combinations that prioritized speed over power, hoping to find some gap in his defense that would allow her to end this before exhaustion claimed her completely. But Guts had fought opponents faster than her, more skilled than her, more deadly than her, and he had learned the fundamental truth that speed and skill meant nothing if you could simply refuse to die. The Dragon Slayer caught her lightsaber in another bind, this time locking the plasma blade against dark metal in a configuration that physics suggested should result in the sword's immediate destruction. But the blade held, as it always had, and Guts twisted hard enough to tear the weapon from Ventress's weakened grip. She stood before him unarmed, her pale face composed despite her defeat, her hands empty of weapons but not of pride. "Do it," she said quietly. "I will not beg." Guts raised the Dragon Slayer, its massive blade poised to fall, and looked into her red eyes and saw there something he recognized. Not the madness of apostles or the casual cruelty of nobles who viewed humans as disposable resources, but the hard determination of someone who had survived things that should have broken them, who had learned to channel pain into purpose, who fought not because they loved violence, but because they knew nothing else. The Dragon Slayer remained raised. The moment stretched. Around them, Battle droids began retreating as the Separatist command recognized their advantage had evaporated. "Go," Guts said. Ventress stared at him, her expression cycling through surprise and suspicion before settling into wary acceptance. "Why?" "Because killing you won't change anything, and I'm tired of meaningless deaths." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once and turned away. The Force gathered around her, and she leapt skyward in a trajectory that took her toward the retreating dropships. Within moments she had disappeared into smoke and distance, leaving Guts standing alone amid the wreckage. Kenobi appeared from the dissipating chaos, his lightsaber extinguished, his robes singed from near misses but his bearing calm as always. He looked at the abandoned lightsaber lying on the permacrete, then at Guts, then back at the retreating Separatist forces. "You let her go," the Jedi observed. "Yes." "That was unexpected, and possibly merciful, though I suspect mercy wasn't your primary motivation." Guts lowered the Dragon Slayer and planted it point first in the ground. "She'll come back. They always do. And when she does, maybe she'll understand that some fights aren't worth winning." Kenobi smiled, and the expression carried genuine warmth despite the destruction surrounding them. "That's the first truly hopeful thing I've heard you say. Perhaps there's a Jedi hiding under all that armor after all." "Don't push it," Guts growled. The battle for Christophsis was over. The Republic had held, casualties remained within acceptable parameters, and the Separatist forces had withdrawn to regroup. In strategic terms, it was a minor victory in a war that would consume the galaxy for years to come. But for Guts, standing in the ruins of an alien city fighting an enemy that meant nothing to him personally, it represented something else entirely, a moment of choice. A decision to spare an enemy when killing would have been easier, a small rejection of the darkness that had defined him since the eclipse. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness, wasn't even particularly meaningful in the larger context of the Clone Wars' grinding mathematics, but it was something. They departed Christophsis 3 days later aboard a Venator-class star destroyer named Resolute, the massive warship serving as Anakin Skywalker's flagship during his campaigns across the Outer Rim. The ship was a city unto itself, capable of carrying an entire legion of clone troopers along with their support equipment, starfighters, and the logistical apparatus necessary to sustain prolonged military operations. Guts stood in an observation deck watching Christophsis recede into the starfield, its crystalline surface reflecting the system's twin suns in patterns that would have been beautiful if he could forget the bodies buried beneath those glittering facets. The Republic had claimed victory, the news networks would proclaim triumph, and the war would continue with the mindless inevitability of a machine that could not stop until every component had been destroyed. "First time in space?" Anakin asked, approaching from behind with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years on ships like this. "First time conscious of it," Guts replied. "I remember darkness when I was brought here. This is different. It takes some getting used to. The scale, the distances between stars, the way battles can span entire systems." Anakin moved to stand beside him, his reflection visible in the transparasteel viewport. "Kenobi told me about your decision, letting Ventress go. He disapprove?" "No. Surprised, maybe. The Jedi Code teaches us to value life, to seek peaceful resolution when possible, but the Code also understands that sometimes mercy is a tactical error. Ventress will return with more forces, and people will die because you chose to spare her." "I know. Then why did you do it?" Guts considered the question, examining his motivations with the same brutal honesty he applied to combat assessment. Why had he spared her? Not from compassion, he barely understood that concept anymore. Not from strategic calculation, killing a Separatist commander would have served Republic interests. Not even from weariness with death, though he carried enough corpses in his memory to populate a city. "Because I wanted to prove I could," he said finally, that I'm more than just a weapon pointed at whatever enemy presents itself, that I can choose something other than violence. Anakin was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful in a way that made him seem older than his 20 years. I understand that. The need to prove you're more than what the war makes you. The Jedi Council sometimes forgets that we're not just instruments of the Force, that we have our own will, our own choices to make. You sound like someone who's had that argument before. More times than I can count. The Council wants me to follow the code absolutely, to trust in the Force's will and let go of attachments. But I can't, won't. There are people I care about more than the Council's philosophy, and if that makes me a bad Jedi, then maybe being a good Jedi isn't worth what it costs. The words carried undertones of rebellion that Guts recognized immediately. He had heard similar sentiments in mercenary camps, spoken by soldiers who fought for causes they barely believed in, sustained only by personal loyalty to commanders who valued them as individuals rather than disposable resources. This Jedi code, Guts said. What does it actually require? There is no emotion. There is peace, Anakin recited, his voice taking on the formal cadence of liturgy. There is no ignorance. There is knowledge. There is no passion. There is serenity. There is no chaos. There is harmony. There is no death. There is the Force. That's not a code. That's a denial of everything that makes you human. Welcome to the Jedi Order, Anakin said with a bitter smile. We're warrior monks who aren't supposed to feel anything while defending people we're not supposed to care about, using powers we're not supposed to question in service of a republic that's not supposed to fail. And you wonder why people join the Separatists. The observation hung in the air between them, dangerous in its implication but undeniably accurate. Anakin's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, consideration, defensiveness, before settling into reluctant agreement. The system is broken, he admitted quietly. The Republic, the Jedi, the whole structure that's supposed to maintain peace and justice across the galaxy. It's been failing for generations, and the Clone Wars are just symptoms of deeper rot. But what's the alternative? Let Count Dooku and his separatists tear it all down and replace it with corporate tyranny? At least the Republic's ideals are worth defending, even if the reality falls short. Guts thought about Midland, about the kingdom he had fought to preserve, about nobles who sent peasants to die in wars over borders and succession while living in luxury, paid for by taxation that crushed those same peasants. The specific details were different, but the fundamental corruption was identical power protecting itself while ordinary people suffered and died. Your war doesn't have a good side, he said. Just different brands of oppression fighting over who gets to exploit the galaxy. Maybe. Probably. But I've seen what the Separatists do to captured worlds. The slavery, the torture, the casual disregard for life. At least the Republic pretends to care about its citizens. That pretense matters. Before Guts could respond, an alarm chimed softly through the observation deck, and Anakin's comlink activated with Kenobi's voice. Anakin, we've received new orders from the Jedi Council. You're needed in the war room immediately. On my way, Master. Anakin turned to Guts. You should come too. This affects you. The war room occupied the Resolute's central command deck, a circular chamber dominated by a massive holographic display that could render entire star systems in tactical overlay. Kenobi stood at the display's center, studying a sector map marked with Republic blue and Separatist red in configurations that suggested recent conflict. Cody and several other clone commanders occupied stations around the room's perimeter, their attention focused on data feeds scrolling across smaller displays. The holographic image shifted as Anakin and Guts entered, zooming to focus on a single system near the outer rim's edge. The primary world appeared unremarkable, standard Class M planet with adequate resources and strategic location, the kind of prize both sides fought over with depressing regularity. Ryloth, Kenobi said without preamble. homeworld of the Twi'lek people, currently under separatist occupation. The blockade has been in place for 2 months, and the civilian population is suffering. The Council has authorized a relief operation. They want us to break the blockade, Anakin said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who lived for exactly this kind of challenge. Finally, I've been arguing for Ryloth intervention since the occupation began. Yes, well, the Council moves at its own pace. Regardless, we've been assigned to lead the assault. 3 Venator-class destroyers, full clone complement, and Jedi command. The operation begins in 72 hours. Kenobi's gaze shifted to Guts, who had remained near the room's entrance, his armored bulk making the space feel smaller. Which brings us to you. The Council has been informed of your participation at Christophsis, and they have questions. They want to know if I'm a threat, Guts said flatly. They want to understand what you are and where you came from. Master Yoda in particular has expressed interest in meeting you. And if I refuse? Then you're free to leave at the next Republic-controlled system. We'll provide transport, basic supplies, and you can disappear into the galaxy. No obligations, no pursuit, Kenobi paused, but I would ask you to reconsider. The operation on Ryloth will be difficult, and we need every advantage. Your combat abilities could save lives, both clone and civilian. Guts studied the holographic display, watching red separatist markers orbit Ryloth in blockade patterns designed to strangle the world through simple denial of resources. Somewhere down there, people were starving, suffering, dying. Not because of anything they had done, but because they had the misfortune to exist on a strategically valuable world during a war between forces that viewed them as acceptable collateral damage. It was Midland all over again. The Band of the Hawk defending villages against armies that would reduce them to rubble for no reason beyond tactical advantage. The Eclipse consuming everything in pursuit of a dream that had always been a lie. But this time, he could choose. Not to believe in the Republic's cause, he understood too well how power corrupted regardless of stated ideals. Not to embrace the Jedi philosophy, their denial of emotion was as alien to him as this entire galaxy. But to use his strength for something beyond simple survival. To place the Dragon Slayer between civilians and the machinery of war, even if only for a moment, even if it changed nothing in the larger calculus of conflict. I'll go to Ryloth, he said, but after that, I want to meet this Master Yoda. I have questions of my own. Kenobi nodded, and something in his expression suggested he had expected exactly this answer. Then welcome aboard, Guts. Officially, Commander Cody will assign you quarters and brief you on standard operating procedures. We jumped to hyperspace in 6 hours. The quarters were small but functional, designed for clone officers who valued efficiency over comfort. A narrow bunk, storage lockers for equipment, basic refresher facilities, and a small desk with data terminal access. Guts set the Dragon Slayer against one wall and began the process of armor maintenance, examining each plate for damage that could compromise protection in future combat. The work was familiar, almost meditative, his hands moving through cleaning and repair with the automatic precision of ritual. He had performed these same actions 10,000 times, in camps and caves and brief moments of safety between battles, and the simple repetition connected him to who he had been before the eclipse transformed everything. A soft chime announced a visitor. Guts ignored it and continued working, and after a moment the door slid open to reveal Ahsoka Tano. The young Padawan stood in the doorway with the uncertain posture of someone who had been told to do something but wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. Commander Cody said you wouldn't answer, she said, so I should just come in. Cody was right. Ahsoka entered and examined the room with open curiosity, her blue eyes taking in the armor components spread across every available surface, the massive sword that seemed too large for the space, the general atmosphere of someone who lived perpetually ready for violence. I'm Ahsoka, she said, extending a hand in greeting. Anakin's Padawan. We didn't get properly introduced on Christophsis." Guts glanced at the offered hand but continued working on his pauldron strapping. "I know who you are, right. Well, I wanted to thank you. For the battle, you saved a lot of lives down there. I killed droids. They're not alive. You know what I mean." Ahsoka lowered her hand and settled into a cross-legged position on the floor, apparently unbothered by his lack of social grace. "The clones talk about you. They call you the Black Swordsman. Some of them think you're a Jedi in disguise. I'm not. I know. I can sense the Force around you, but you don't touch it. You exist in the current like." She paused, searching for words. "Like a stone in a river. The water flows around you, but you remain unchanged." That's what the pale woman said. "Ventress isn't wrong about everything, just most things." Ahsoka watched him work for a moment in comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something? About why you let her go?" "You can ask." "Master Kenobi says mercy is a Jedi virtue, but Anakin says sometimes mercy is just another word for weakness. Which is it?" Guts set down the pauldron and looked at the young Padawan directly for the first time. She was what, 14? 15? Old enough to fight in this war, but young enough that the killing hadn't completely deadened something essential in her eyes. He remembered being that age, remembered thinking that skill with a sword could protect him from the world's cruelty, remembered the naive certainty that had died screaming at the eclipse. "It's neither," he said. "Mercy is a choice you make when you have the power to do otherwise. Sometimes it's the right choice. Sometimes it gets people killed, but it's always a choice, and that matters more than whether it's virtuous or weak." Ahsoka considered this, her head tails twitching in a way that suggested deep thought. "The Jedi Code says there's no emotion, only peace. But you felt something when you spared her. I could sense it in the Force, not quite hope, but something close, like you were trying to prove something to yourself. You're perceptive for a child. I'm not a child. I'm a Jedi Padawan. You're both. And that's going to cause you problems if you survive long enough to grow up." The words came out harsher than he had intended, and Ahsoka's expression flickered through hurt before settling into stubborn determination. "I'll survive. I have to. Too many people are counting on me." Guts recognized that burden, the weight of others' expectations, the crushing pressure of being important to something larger than yourself, the way responsibility could become a prison more secure than any cell. He had carried that weight when leading the band of the Hawks raiding parties, when protecting Casca during the escape from the Tower of Conviction, when fighting to preserve what little remained of his humanity against the Berserker armor's seduction. "The people counting on you," he said quietly, "are the ones who'll get you killed, not through malice, just through the simple mathematics of war. Someone you care about will be in danger, and you'll do something stupid to save them, and then you'll both die. That's a dark way to see the world. It's an accurate way. Ask anyone who's survived long enough to bury their friends." Ahsoka stood, her expression troubled but not defeated. "I should go, but thank you for talking to me, even if you're kind of depressing." She left, and Guts returned to his maintenance work, but the conversation lingered in his mind like smoke that refused to dissipate. The young Padawan reminded him too much of who he had been: idealistic, determined, certain that skill and commitment could overcome any obstacle. The Clone Wars would either kill her or break her, and both outcomes seemed equally inevitable. He finished maintaining his armor as the Resolute's engines shifted to hyperspace configuration, their deep thrumming vibration transmitting through every bulkhead. Through the small viewport in his quarters, Guts watched the stars stretch and blur into lines of light that defied every principle of physics his world had understood. Somewhere ahead lay Ryloth and the blockade, and another battle that would change nothing in the larger war's grinding progress. But for now, suspended in hyperspace between one moment of violence and the next, Guts allowed himself to simply exist. To feel the weight of the Dragon Slayer resting against the wall, to know that his armor was ready for whatever came next. To acknowledge that he had chosen this, had accepted alliance with warriors who fought for a cause he didn't believe in, because the alternative was dying alone in a ruined city. It wasn't much. Wasn't redemption or purpose or anything approaching peace, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough.